Amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 113-10. That amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read. No amendment to that amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be in order except those printed in House Report 113-60. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report by a member designated in the report, shall be considered read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 1, printed in House Report 113-60. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in House Report number 113-60, offered by Mr. Sessions of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 216, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I believe that excessive government regulations are a significant barrier to private sector job growth and the creation of those jobs. House Republicans have made job creation a priority, and as a result, we must work to ensure that the federal government reviews new regulations to ensure that their proposed benefits outweigh any potential economic harm. My amendment today is simple. It requires the SEC to include an assessment of anticipated jobs gained or lost as a result of implementation of any major rule, and to specify whether those jobs will come from the public or private sector. Mr. Chairman, according to a study released by the Small Business Administration in 2010, federal regulations cost small businesses $1.75 trillion every year to comply. That is money which could be used by American companies to hire new employees or to reinvest in their own business. H.R. 1062 ensures that the federal government does not necessarily burden American companies with cumbersome regulations by guaranteeing that those regulations are appropriate and necessary. My amendment adds to this review process by making sure we have a more comprehensive understanding of the economic impacts a regulation creates. I believe that the amendment I offer today serves to strengthen the underlying legislation by insisting that the SEC begins to focus on job creation and, specifically, enabling the private sector, not furthering a liberal agenda that is intentionally harming families, job creation, and small business across America. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I support the underlying bill and legislation that the gentleman from New Jersey brings to the floor today. I yield back the balance of my time.
Is the gentleman reserved?
I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I claim time in opposition to the amendment, although I do not oppose the amendment.
Objection? The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I claim time in opposition to the amendment, although I do not oppose the amendment. I yield myself such time as I may consume. This amendment adds a requirement that the SEC analyze the number of jobs created or lost as a result of a new rule or order, while differentiating between public and private sector jobs. Although this amendment is not by itself problematic, it layers one more requirement onto a bill already bursting with onerous cost-benefit requirements. And while counting the jobs created or lost because of a particular regulation is a noble goal, we have to view this goal in the context of the overall bill, which tips the scales heavily in favor of of industry over investors, including the pension plans for millions of Americans. The criteria by which the SEC would need to engage in cost-benefit analysis under H.R. 1062 would have the Commission make all decisions on the basis of whether the rules impose the least burden on market participants. In fact, nowhere in the bill are the words investor protection used, despite the fact that a central mission of the Securities and Exchange Commission is to protect investors. Let's be clear. H.R. 1062 is essentially a solution in search of a problem. This bill is not about refining the SEC's cost-benefit analysis. The Commission, in fact, has already done that by adopting a new set of guidelines to ensure that its analysis meets the very high bar set in the decision overturning their proxy access rule. Instead, this bill is about making it easier for industry groups to overturn SEC regulations in the courts. After the 2008 financial crisis, the public spoke, and they demanded that Congress stand up and legislate rules of the road to prevent another crisis. So we took action to regulate the over-the-counter derivatives market, improve the corporate governance, implement the Volcker Rule to stop commercial banks from gambling with depositor money, and reform the credit ratings agency that slapped AAA ratings onto toxic securities. Having lost that battle here in Congress, the industry, with the help of some of my colleagues on the opposite side of the aisle, is now waging a new quiet battle to have these regulations thrown out in court. H.R. 1062 abets that goal by making it significantly easier for the industry to win in court. And this is a key differentiation from the President's executive order on cost-benefit analysis, whose requirements cannot be used as a basis for litigation. So again, this amendment is harmless, but it amends what is a deeply problematic bill. So I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in House Report 113-60. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 2, printed in House Report Number 113-60, offered by Mr. Hurt of Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 216, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Hurt, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of my amendment to H.R. 1062, the SEC Regulatory Accountability Act, introduced by my friend, Chairman Scott Garrett. His bill is an important step forward to ensure the SEC abides by the President's executive order and also enhances the SEC's existing cost-benefit analysis requirements. My amendment assures that rules adopted by the PCAOB, the MSRB, and other national securities associations under the purview of the SEC have the same requirements as the SEC itself, and requires the SEC to attest that these associations are in compliance with its own economic assessment standards. These subordinate organizations can develop standards and rules that have the same effect as federal regulations. As rules put forth by these organizations generally go through a final SEC rulemaking process, they should be subject also to that same cost-benefit analysis. As we saw with the SEC's proxy access rule that was thrown out by the D.C. federal court for lack of proper assessment of the rule's economic costs, not only is this practice good government, but it's common sense. In light of reports that the SEC is considering discretionary rulemakings that would impose additional unnecessary costs, resulting in little or no benefit, and being of questionable constitutionality, we must ensure that the SEC and the associations under its purview abide by sound economic analysis. With our economy still struggling in many areas in Virginia's 5th District, nearing double-digit unemployment, we must ensure that our regulations are making it easier for our businesses to access the capital they need to create the jobs in our communities. I thank Chairman Garrett for his work on this important issue, and I urge support for my amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I claim time in opposition to the amendment. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The lady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment doubles down on all of the problems raised by H.R. 1062 by imposing the same burdensome cost-benefit analysis requirements on the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Boards, or MSRB, and certain self-regulatory organizations as the underlying bill imposes on the SEC. Beyond the problems caused by H.R. 1062, this amendment would further put individual citizens and taxpayers at risk by tying the hands of the MSRB, which is entrusted with regulating dealers of municipal securities, including city bond issuances. The Wall Street Reform Act expanded the mission of the board to protect state and local governments and to regulate, for the first time in history, the individuals that provide municipalities with financial advice. We had good reason to expand the mission and responsibilities of the MSRB under Dodd-Frank. Like many borrowers who were sold exotic mortgages based on the representations made by mortgage brokers in the lead-up to the financial crisis, we saw that many municipalities entered into complex financial instruments that they didn't fully understand. At the same time, we saw that many financial advisors to municipalities were involved in pay-to-play scandals and recommended unsuitable investments, particularly to small communities. The result was the imposition of substantial costs on taxpayers in communities across the country. The most high-profile example is the case of Jefferson County, Alabama, which entered into the largest municipal bankruptcy in history after a simple sewer bond financing deal ended with the county going broke over faulty interest rate derivatives. This amendment would make it much more difficult for the MSRB to regulate the financial entities selling these derivatives products to our small counties, cities, and towns. But that's just one example. The amendment would impose similar onerous requirements on the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, that is FINRA, the self-regulatory organization for broker-dealers, and the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, which regulates the auditing industry. Again, this amendment doubles down on what is already a harmful bill by extending the same onerous requirements on self-regulatory organizations. I see no reason why the Congress would want to further tip the scales in favor of Wall Street over Main Street. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. What does gentleman from Virginia rise?
Mr. Chairman, I'm prepared to close and would like to insist on my right to do so and reserve my time.
Gentleman from Virginia reserves. Gentlelady from California.
I yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Georgia.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let me just clear the air on one important thing. We know that there is a value for cost-benefit analysis. What we're saying is this is the wrong approach because they're not after cost-benefit analysis. They're after tying the hands of the Securities and Exchange Commission to lessen the regulations. We have a bill, Mr. Speaker, which is a bipartisan bill by myself, along with Representative Conway from Texas, a Republican, that is a more thoughtful, a more direct and beneficial way of cost-benefit analysis, because we do not have into that bill this very convoluting, confining requirement of what we call look back. You've got to remember, when the telling point about Mr. Garrett's bill is that he requires that the SEC look back at every single rule for the last 80 years, since 1934. There is no federal agency that has even nearly that kind of burden. And on top of that, does not allocate one dime for any needed staff. It is indeed a burden. So the point I want to make is that we understand when he says, okay, let's make sure that we have a cost and a benefit of what they're doing. Yeah, we go along with that. But my bill, along with Representative Conway, we digested this bill. We have passed this bill, our bill, which has a more reasonable approach to cost-benefit analysis, out of the Agriculture Committee, and will be before this House that has a better approach. So we're not opposed to this cost-benefit analysis, but we are opposed to this measure, which is designed to tie the hands of the SEC by allowing them and mandating that they look at every record, every rule, all the way back to 1934. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself the balance of my time.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I would just say a couple of things in closing. First, what this bill is not is it a bill that does anything to amend or change the mandates of the SEC. We know what those mandates are. They are to ensure fair markets, efficient markets. They are to facilitate capital formation, and finally, investor protection. And they are all designed to work together. And this bill does nothing to change that mandate. In fact, the bill, if you look at it, talks about cost and benefit analysis repeatedly throughout the entire bill. And I would suggest to you that investor protection includes liquid markets, formation of capital. If we want to protect investors, obviously we need to have healthy markets. And that's what this bill ensures by requiring the SEC conduct the most simple, routine cost-benefit analysis, something that the President, by the way, has offered up and required of most federal agencies that are affected by his executive order. This simply makes them a part of that. In addition, SEC Chairman had stated earlier that that was what her belief should be for the SEC in conducting these cost-benefit analysis. So this simply codifies, as is our responsibility as members of Congress, to do just that. With that in mind, I would ask that this body adopt our amendment, and with that, I yield back my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. All those in favor will say aye. All those opposed will say no. The opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
I request a recorded vote.
The gentlelady requests a recorded vote pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18. Further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia will be postponed. It's now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in House Report 113-60. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New York seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in House Report Number 113-60, offered by Mrs. Carolyn Maloney of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 216, the gentlewoman from New York, Mrs. Maloney, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York.
I thank the Chair, and I recognize myself for as much time as I may consume. First, I would like to say that I am happy to work with Mr. Garrett on a variety of issues. I respect his leadership, but I must respectfully and strongly disagree with him on this issue before us today. It seems clear that the intended effect of the Republican bill is to cripple the SEC, just as it undertakes the very tough and important job of implementing the badly needed reforms we passed in Dodd-Frank. And may I remind my colleagues that we passed Dodd-Frank in response to the worst financial crisis in our lifetime, one in which we were at one point losing 700,000 jobs a month, and by some estimates the loss was well over $12 trillion. My amendment strikes the underlying bill and puts a sense of Congress in its place. My amendment contains findings that very clearly lay out the cost-benefit analysis process that the SEC already has to go through in proposing or adopting a rule. What this bill would do now, the Republican bill, is handcuff the SEC commissioners with unnecessary red tape so that the Commission will be unable to protect investors effectively. Despite what the other side of the aisle is saying, there is already a multi-layered and effective cost-benefit analysis built into the SEC rulemaking process. The SEC is already required by law to do cost-benefit analysis under the Paperwork Reduction Act and the Congressional Review Act and the Regulatory Flexibility Act, and for the SEC specifically under the National Securities Market Improvement Act of 1996. In fact, just last year the GAO issued a report praising the SEC's guidance on cost-benefit analysis, saying, and I quote, "The basic elements of good regulatory economic analysis," end quote. And in evaluating a recent proposal on swaps regulation, the co-chairman of the Financial Services Department at Caldwalder wrote, and I quote, "The SEC release contains the most detailed attempt at an economic analysis of the effect of the rules that I have seen from any agency," end quote. But under this Republican bill, the SEC would have to divert its limited budget resources away from enforcement or examining the impact of worldwide derivatives market only to duplicate things it is already doing. This bill also says that every 5 years the SEC is required to do a cost-benefit analysis of every regulation it has ever issued on any subject, going back some 80 years, back to day one in 1933. And it would have to magically do all of this without one additional red cent of additional funding to cover the cost of it. If we want to highlight anything, we should be highlighting the extensive process that exists and the judicial scrutiny that it includes, which is what my amendment does. The stated mission of the SEC is to protect investors, not give them more red tape, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation. Let's help them do that, not just make them jump through unnecessary, costly, and duplicative hoops. The underlying bill, the Republican bill, is a prescription for paralysis of the SEC's ability to protect investors. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I maintain the balance of my time, and I reserve it.
The gentlelady reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
I rise in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks. So, first of all, I appreciate the gentlelady's offer of an amendment here. I also appreciate the fact that the lady and I have often worked together on legislation in the past in our respective committee. But on this one, I humbly disagree. As she says, the amendment before us basically guts the bill and simply sets forth a sense of Congress. 2 points, one on policy and one on practicality here. On policy, if this was the gentlelady's idea that this is the way we should go on this piece of underlying legislation, as a ranking member of the subcommittee and a member of the full committee, she had every opportunity in the world to come before the committee at the time and put this before us, at which time we could have had a full and complete debate on it. Had we done so, we probably would have pointed out to her 2 things. One, she makes reference to the D.C. Circuit Court's of opinion on line 14 through 18 of her case. Would that the D.C. Circuit Court had said that the SEC is doing a good job, that they had the authority to do so, and nothing else is necessary going forward. But if she read the opinion, she would know that's not quite what they said. The D.C. Court stated, and I quote, that the SEC, the Commission, acted arbitrarily and capriciously for having failed, note this, once again, so this is not the only time, but once again, to adequately assess the economic effects of the new rule and, again, inconsistently and opportunistically frame cost benefits of the rule. So the citation that she gives to the D.C. Circuit Court does not support her position, but undermines her position. D.C. Circuit basically supports our position that the SEC has failed, and they have failed repeatedly to do what they should do, and that is why we have the legislation here before you today. And when she talks about red tape and unnecessary, well, that's not what the AFL-CIO says, and that's not what the American Bar Association says. You know, the SEC did look at the issue of doing a retrospective look at this. They did so back over a year and a half ago, back in September of 11. And asked for input. And what did the AFL-CIO say about that? This is what I say, quote, to be effective, security regulations must be continuously updated to address the emergency of new loopholes, abuses, and market failures. Likewise, the ABA, also American Bar Association, also chimed in as saying about the retrospective analysis, which is what the SEC could have been doing, should have been doing, didn't do, and that is what our bill will require them to do. So I appreciate the gentlelady's efforts in this area, but I would recommend a no vote on her amendment. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from New York.
I would like to point out to my colleague that the Circuit Court decision underlines the point that I'm making in my amendment. It says clearly that there is a cost-benefit analysis that are required by the SEC, and made clear that there is a judicial review. Not only the analysis is required, but you can always appeal to the court. I yield the remaining of my time to the distinguished ranking member, Maxine Waters, from the great state of California.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 30
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman and members, I'd like to thank the gentlelady from New York for bringing this amendment forth today. As a matter of fact, the opposite side should thank her too, because she's given them an opportunity to back out of this awful bill that would be harmful and is ill-informed, and to get on with just saying that her resolution would make good sense. So I'm eager to support this amendment. From the gentlelady from New York, the amendment strikes all bill text and replaces it with a sense of Congress, reiterating all the economic analysis requirements already imposed on the SEC. Specifically, current law requires the SEC to conduct economic analysis pursuant to the Paperwork Reduction Act, the Congressional Review Act, the Regulatory Flexibility Act, as well as additional cost-benefit analysis per the National Securities Markets Improvement Act. Thank you.
Gentleman from New Jersey yields back. All times expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from New York. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
On that, I request the yeas and the nays.
Gentlelady requests the yeas and nays.
Well, Mr. Speaker,
We won.
Mr. Speaker,
It is not the yeas and nays. Gentleman from New Jersey.
I hereby request yeas and nays. Recorded vote, I should say.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from New York will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments printed in House Report 113-60, on which further proceedings were postponed, in the following order. Amendment number 2 by Mr. Hurt of Virginia, and Amendment number 3 by Mrs. Maloney of New York. The chair will reduce to 2 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote after the first vote in this series. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on Amendment number 2, printed in House Report 113-60 by the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Hurt, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in House Report number 113-60, offered by Mr. Hurt of Virginia.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a request for recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
So general debate and amendment debate is complete. Members now voting on amendments to the measure requiring the Securities and Exchange Commission to conduct a cost-benefit analysis before issuing a new regulation. So amendments first, and then votes upon a possible procedural motion and then we expect a vote on final passage to follow that. The series of votes starting with an amendment brought by Congressman Hurt of Virginia that would stipulate that rules adopted by the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board have to comply with the same standards at the Securities and Exchange Commission. We expect this to be the last bit of legislative business for the week in the House. Right now, a 15-minute vote, and while this is underway, the House Ways and Means Committee has been meeting today, taking testimony on the Internal Revenue Service's treatment of conservative groups. Committee members hearing from the acting IRS Commissioner, Stephen Miller, who resigned earlier this week over the agency's targeting of certain politically oriented groups. We've been airing the hearing live on our companion network, C-SPAN 2. So during this vote, we will go back and show you some of the testimony in the hearing from earlier as it got underway at about 9 this morning.
Come to order. On May 10th, Lois Lerner, Director of Exempt Organizations for the Internal Revenue Service division that oversees tax-exempt groups, finally acknowledged that the agency had been targeting conservative-leaning political organizations. 4 days later, the Treasury Inspector General for Taxpayer Administration confirmed that, and I quote, the IRS used inappropriate criteria to identify organizations applying for tax-exempt status, end quote. The report also confirmed that this abuse of power began as far back as 2010. This revelation goes against the very principles of free speech and liberty upon which this country was founded. The blatant disregard with which the agency has treated Congress and the American taxpayer raises serious concerns about leadership at the IRS. Let's establish the facts that we do know. Based on the TIGTA report, we know that for an 18-month period beginning in spring 2010, IRS employees in the agency's determinations unit employed key words such as Tea Party, Patriot, and 912 to target applications for tax-exempt status. These groups were then subjected to further IRS investigation and document requests. IRS employees later expanded their search to include groups concerned about government spending, debt, taxes, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, or trying to, and I quote, make America a better place to live, end quote. Let me repeat that. People were targeted for trying to make America a better place to live. These Americans had their applications delayed for nearly 3 years, and at least 98 applicants were asked for improper and inappropriate information such as donor lists and whether family members planned to run for political office. During that delay, and while applications of conservative groups sat untouched for more than a year, other applications with names like Progress and Progressive were approved in just a matter of months. The headline in USA Today from earlier this week really says it all. IRS gave liberals a pass, Tea Party groups put on hold. TIGTA's audit found that some of those cases should have been set aside because of concerns related to their potential political activity. But no such review was done. Without objection, I enter the USA Today news report into the record. This week, we learned that senior IRS officials knew about this activity almost 2 years ago in June of 2011, and IRS's leadership in Washington knew of it in May 2012, a year ago. Despite a 2-year-long investigation by this committee, the IRS never told the American people or their representatives about this simple truth. In fact, we were repeatedly told no such targeting was happening. That isn't being misled. That's lying. But now we know the truth, or at least some of it. We also know that these revelations are just the tip of the iceberg. It would be a mistake to treat this as just one scandal. This may be the one generating headlines, but in total, I count at least 5 serious violations of taxpayer rights, the right to be treated fairly, honestly, and impartially by their government. First, back in August of 2010, a White House official discussed the status of a private company, the tax status of a private company, a clear intimidation tactic. Second, in June of 2010, the targeting of conservative groups began. Third, in May of 2011, the IRS started to threaten donors to conservative-leaning nonprofits that they were liable for certain taxes. And fourth, in March of 2012, the Huffington Post published the confidential 2008 donor list of the National Organization for Marriage, a conservative tax-exempt organization. And fifth, but unlikely the final transgression, ProPublica announced that the IRS had leaked confidential applications for tax-exempt status from conservative groups. Mr. Miller, with all due respect, this systematic abuse cannot be fixed with just one resignation, or two. And as much as I expect more people need to go, the reality is this is not a personnel problem. This is a problem of the IRS being too large, too powerful, too intrusive, and too abusive of honest, hard-working taxpayers. There isn't a person I come into contact with at home, or anyone in this country, frankly, who does not fear the IRS. They fear getting something wrong on their tax filings, and they fear the IRS's ability to audit them and wreak havoc in their lives, especially when all they're trying to do is improve their lives, let alone, God forbid, trying to make America a better place to live, which is what the IRS targeted them for. Under that kind of thinking, every civic group in America is at risk. The Knights of Columbus, the Rotary, the JCs, the American Legion, and VFW clubs. I'm sure you're aware of the saying that the power to tax is the power to destroy. Well, under this administration, the IRS has abused its power to tax, and it has destroyed what little faith and hope the American people had in getting a fair shake in Washington. This will not stand. Trimming a few branches will not solve the problem when the roots of the tree have gone rotten. And that is exactly what has happened with our entire tax system. It is rotten at the core, and it must be ripped out so we can start fresh. Only then will the American people get a tax system that treats them fairly and honestly as they deserve. And while that's a larger discussion, it is directly tied to the issue before us today. How and why our tax system has gone so far off track, many questions still remain. Why did the IRS repeatedly target the American people and then keep that fact covered up for so long? Who started the targeting? Who knew? When did they know? And how high did it go? Who leaked the private taxpayer information? Why were the names of donors asked for? And what was done with those lists before they were supposedly discarded? And when did the administration know about each of these, and what was its reaction? Listening to the nightly news, this appears to be just the latest example of a culture of cover-ups and political intimidation in this administration. It seems like the truth is hidden from the American people just long enough to make it through an election. The American people have a right to the truth, to a government that delivers the facts, good or bad, no matter what. President Obama promised to be different and to deliver a better government, the most transparent in history. He was right. America deserves better. It is time to end the corruption at the IRS and fix a tax code that allows Washington and the IRS to pick who wins and who loses in America. I expect nothing less than total cooperation by the IRS and this administration as we investigate what happened and what we must do to fix it. I now recognize Ranking Member Levin for the purpose of his opening statement and thank him for his commitment to pursue this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to read my opening statement. I will expand on it a bit now that I've heard the opening statement of the chairman. This committee, on a bipartisan basis, takes seriously its oversight role, and we are fully committed to ensuring an IRS that serves the American people fairly and efficiently. What is now completely clear is that the management and oversight of the agency's handling of tax exemption applications have completely failed the American people. I emphasize that. As we know from the Inspector General's audit, the agency used totally inappropriate criteria in its review of tax exemption applications, singling out organizations for review based on their name or political views rather than their actual activities. These criteria changed 4 times over 2 years, with little management review or oversight. Applications sat for years. Work stopped for 13 months while one department waited to hear back from another. Questions were asked that were not necessary. Again, no oversight, no accountability. All of us are angry at this on behalf of the nation, and we are determined to get answers to our questions about how this happened to ensure that it does not happen again. Finally, throughout this time, the IRS leadership has demonstrated a total disregard for the oversight role of the Congress and this committee. Former IRS Commissioner Schulman testified in front of us in March 2012 and said that, in quotes, no targeting, end of quotes, was going on. 2 months later, he was briefed on the IG's investigation and was fully informed that indeed singling out by name had occurred on his watch. He had an obligation to return to this committee and set the record straight. So did Mr. Miller. Neither fulfilled their obligations. A little more than a week ago, Lois Lerner was in front of our Oversight Subcommittee. She serves as the director of the Exempt Organization Division, and she has been directly involved in this matter. Yet she failed to disclose what she knew to this committee, choosing instead to do so at an ABA conference 2 days later. This is wholly unacceptable, and one of the reasons that we believe, and as I stated several days ago, Ms. Lerner should be relieved of her duties. Chairman Camp and I put together this hearing on a bipartisan basis to get the facts. We must seek the truth, not political gain. And I just want to add in that regard. Mr. Camp has said, listening to the nightly news, this appears to be just the latest example of a culture of cover-ups and political intimidation in this administration. It seems like the truth is hidden from the American people just long enough to make it through an election. I totally disagree. If this hearing becomes essentially a bootstrap to continue the campaign of 2012 and to prepare for 2014, we will be making a very, very serious mistake and indeed not meeting our obligation of trust to the American people. You're here today, Mr. Miller. You're here today, the Inspector General, to talk about what happened, how it happened, where it happened, who knew what when. And if instead this hearing essentially becomes an effort to score political points, it will be a disregard of the duties of this committee. So I conclude with the sentence, we must seek the truth, not political gain. We look forward to full and forthcoming answers to our questions today.
Thank you. Before the witnesses are recognized for their opening statements, I will first swear them in. While this is the prerogative of every committee chair, it has not been the custom here at Ways and Means, but then it's not customary for this committee to have been so repeatedly misled by an agency under its purview. So while it's always against the law to provide false statements to Congress, the act of swearing in a witness impresses upon him or her the gravity of the proceeding and the need to tell the full and complete truth. Please raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Let the record reflect that witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you. I would like to welcome J. Russell George, who has been the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration. I think we'll wait for the camera pool to leave at this point. Thank you. I'd like to welcome J. Russell George, who has been the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration since 2002, and Mr. Stephen Miller, who is currently the Acting Commissioner for the IRS. Thank you both for being with us today. You will each have 5 minutes to present your testimony with your full written testimony submitted for the record. Mr. George, we'll begin with you. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Camp, Ranking Member Levin, members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss our report concerning oversight by the Internal Revenue Service of groups that apply for tax-exempt status. As you are aware, the organization that I lead, the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, protects the integrity of the federal tax system. Our audit was initiated based on concerns expressed by members of Congress because of taxpayer allegations that they were subject to unfair treatment by the IRS. Our report issued earlier this week addresses 3 allegations. First, that the IRS targeted specific groups applying for tax-exempt status. Second, that they delayed the processing of these groups' applications. And third, that the IRS requested unnecessary information from groups it subjected to special scrutiny. All 3 allegations were substantiated. The IRS used inappropriate criteria to target for review Tea Party and other organizations based on their name and policy positions. This practice started in 2010 and continued to evolve until June of 2011. As the monitor shows, the IRS was following inappropriate criteria. Let me read to you these criteria from a briefing held by the IRS's exempt organizations function in June of 2011. The criteria included the words Tea Party, Patriots, or 912 Project. Another listed criterion was that the group's issues included government spending, government debt, or taxes. Yet another listing criteria appeared as education of the public by advocacy or lobbying to, quote, make America a better place to live, unquote. Finally, the criterion consisted of any statements in the case file criticizing how the country is being run. The reason for these criteria were inappropriate is that they did not focus on tax-exempt laws and Treasury regulations. For example, 501c3 organizations may not engage in political campaign intervention. 501c4 organizations can, but it must not be their primary activity. Political campaign intervention is action taken on behalf of or against a particular candidate running for office. Although these criteria appeared in the IRS's own documentation as of June 2011, IRS employees actually began selecting Tea Party and other organizations for review in early 2010. From May of 2010 through May of 2012, a team of IRS specialists in Cincinnati, Ohio, referred to as the Determinations Unit, selected 298 cases for additional scrutiny. According to our findings, the first time that executives from Washington, D.C. became aware of the use of these criteria was June 2011, with some executives not becoming aware of the criteria until April or May of 2012. The IRS's inappropriate criteria remained in effect for approximately 18 months. After learning of the inappropriate criteria, the Director of Exempt Organizations changed the criteria in July of 2011 to remove references to organization names and policy positions. However, Cincinnati staff changed the criteria back to target organizations with specific policy positions, but this time they did not include Tea Party or other named organizations. Finally, in May of 2012, after learning that the criteria had again been changed, the Exempt Organizations Director of Rulings and Agreements changed the criteria to be consistent with laws and regulations. The organizations selected for review for significant political campaign intervention, again 298 in all, experienced substantial delays in the processing of their applications. The organizations experiencing these delays included Tea Party organizations, Patriot organizations, 912 organizations, among other organizations. As shown on the monitor, The status as of December 2012 for 296 cases that we reviewed was 108 cases had been approved, 28 cases were withdrawn, and 160 cases were still open. 0 cases had been denied. Of the cases still open, some had been in progress for over 3 years and crossed 2 election cycles without resolution. Of the 108 cases approved, 31 were Tea Party, 912 or Patriot organizations. My final point is that the IRS requested unnecessary information for many political cases. In fact, 98 of 170 cases that received follow-up requests for information from the IRS had unnecessary questions. Our evidence indicates that staff at the Determinations Unit in Cincinnati sent these letters out with little or no supervisory review. The IRS later determined these questions were unneeded, but not until after media accounts and questions by members of Congress arose in March of 2012. Examples of the unnecessary information requested included the names of past and future donors, listings of all issues important to the organization and what the organization's positions were regarding such issues, and whether officers or directors have run for public office or would be running for public office in the future. Months after receiving these questions, 12 of the 98 organizations either received a letter or a telephone call from the IRS stating that their applications were approved and they no longer needed to respond to the additional requests. The IRS informed another 15 organizations that they did not need to respond to previous requests for information, and instead they were sent a revised request for information. Regarding the donor information received from applicants, the IRS informed us that they destroyed that information. In closing, our audit found clear evidence that each of the 3 allegations were correct. Was the IRS using inappropriate criteria in its review of organizations applied for tax-exempt status? Yes. Was the IRS delaying their applications? Yes. And finally, did the IRS ask inappropriate and unnecessary questions of applicants? Again, yes. These findings have raised troubling questions about whether the IRS has effective management oversight and control, at least in the exempt organizations function, so that the public can be reassured that the IRS is impartial in administering the nation's tax laws fairly. Chairman Camp, Ranking Member Levin, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to present my views, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. George. Mr. Miller, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Unfortunately, given time considerations, we received the notice of hearing within the last 2 days. The IRS was unable to prepare written testimony. I would note that I have a very brief statement before I take your questions. First and foremost, as Acting Commissioner, I want to apologize on behalf of the Internal Revenue Service for the mistakes that we made and the poor service we provided. The affected organizations and the American public deserve better. Partisanship, or even the perception of partisanship, has no place at the IRS. It cannot even appear to be a consideration in determining the tax exemption of an organization. I do not believe that partisanship motivated the people who engaged in the practices described in the Treasury Inspector General's report. I've reviewed the Treasury Inspector General's report, and I believe its conclusions are consistent with that. I think that what happened here was that foolish mistakes were made by people trying to be more efficient in their workload selection. The listing described in the report, while intolerable, was a mistake and not an act of partisanship. The agency is moving forward. It has learned its lesson. We've previously worked to correct issues in the processing of the cases described in the report, and we've implemented changes to make sure that this type of thing never happens again. Now that TIGTA has completed its fact-finding...
The nays are 163. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on Amendment Number 3, printed in House Report 113-60 by the gentlewoman from New York, Mrs. Maloney, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in House Report Number 113-60, offered by Mrs. Carolyn B. Maloney of New York.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote.
Members now voting on the Maloney amendment that would note the extensive economic analysis requirements in current SEC law, stressing their acceptance by the GAO. Again, these amendments related to the bill calling on the Securities and Exchange Commission to conduct a cost-benefit analysis before issuing new regulations. Now, we could see votes on a procedural motion next, and then we expect a vote on final passage. The House Ways and Means Committee has been convening today, taking testimony on the Internal Revenue Service's treatment of conservative groups. That hearing got underway this morning at 9, and they heard testimony from IRS Acting Commissioner Stephen Miller, who, of course, resigned earlier this week over the agency's targeting of certain politically oriented groups. That hearing is finished now. Members now moving into the House chamber to take part in the votes that are going on Capitol Hill in the House. We will re-air that hearing tonight as part of our programming. That'll begin at 8 p.m. Eastern here on C-SPAN.
On this vote, the yeas are 165, the nays are 233. The amendment is not adopted. The question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, please say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Accordingly, under the rules, the committee rises.
You almost got obstructed.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House and the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 1062 and pursuant to House Resolution 216 reports the bill back to the House with an amendment adopted in the Committee of the Whole. Under the rule, the previous question is ordered. Is there a separate vote demanded on any amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute reported from the Committee of the Whole? If not, the question is on adoption of the amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is